Stop believing the Hollywood version of Vikings you see on TV, the one where rugged warriors sail endlessly into the sunset, looking clean, stoic, and perfectly groomed. The reality of a Viking longship was a floating nightmare of cramping, sea spray, and a smell so distinct you could probably detect a raiding party before you even saw their sails. You might wonder about their navigation, their weapons, or their conquests, but there is one logistical question that movies conveniently ignore, yet it dictated life and death on the open ocean. How did 60 burly warriors, packed shoulder to shoulder on an open deck, with no below-deck privacy, handle their most basic biological needs during a 3-week voyage across the North Sea? The answer involves dangerous acrobatics, community buckets, and a level of intimacy that would make a modern person scream. You are about to discover the gritty, unpolished truth of Viking hygiene that historians often leave out of the textbooks. To understand the mechanics of using the bathroom on a longship, you first have to understand the architecture of the ship itself. The Viking longship, or drakkar, was an engineering marvel designed for speed, flexibility, and shallow drafts. But it was essentially a giant open canoe. There were no cabins, there were no hidden corners. There was just one single deck, exposed to the freezing wind and rain, packed with men, weapons, supplies, and often livestock. Imagine a space roughly the size of a modern city bus, but strip away the roof and walls and fill it with 30 to 60 armed men. Now imagine you cannot leave this space for days at a time. This was the reality. When nature called, you didn't have the luxury of stepping into a private room, you had an audience. The most common method for relieving oneself was as dangerous as it was simple. If the weather was calm and the seas were flat, a Viking warrior would head to the gunwales, the upper edge of the ship's side. Specifically, they would go to the leeward side, which is the side away from the wind. This is crucial physics. If you chose the windward side, the strong gusts of the North Atlantic would blow everything right back onto the deck, your shipmates, and your food supplies. You can imagine that making that mistake once would earn you a very quick, and likely violent, lesson from the rest of the crew. But this over-the-side method wasn't just about standing there. The sides of a longship weren't high rails like on a modern ferry. They were relatively low to the water. To do their business, a warrior often had to hang their backside over the freezing water while gripping the rigging or the gunwale for dear life. Now picture doing this while the ship is moving at 10 knots, cutting through icy waves. One slip meant falling into the freezing ocean. In heavy chainmail or thick wool clothing, falling overboard usually meant death by drowning or hypothermia before the ship could even turn around. Using the bathroom was quite literally a death-defying act. But what happened when the weather turned? The North Sea is notorious for violent storms, where waves can swell to 30 feet. In these conditions, standing up or hanging over the side was suicide. This is where life on the longship got truly intimate. When the storms hit, the Vikings relied on the bailer, or specific waste buckets. These were large wooden buckets, often used for bailing out seawater, that would be repurposed for human waste when going topside wasn't an option. These buckets would be passed around, or kept in a designated spot. In a storm, with the ship pitching and rolling violently, accuracy was, let's just say, difficult. The contents would then have to be tossed overboard at the first safe opportunity, but until then, the smell of dozens of men and an open bucket of waste would mix with the scent of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and bilge water. It creates a very different mental image than the heroic montage of a movie, doesn't it? But wait, the most shocking part of their daily struggle is still ahead. If you think the bucket situation sounds bad, Wait until you hear about the parasites that were eating them alive from the inside out. We need to talk about the cleanup. Toilet paper obviously did not exist, so what did a Viking use after finishing their business on a rocking ship? The answer is whatever was available. In the context of a ship, the most common tool was moss. Vikings were known to pack dried moss for various uses, including starting fires and packing wounds, but it also served as a soft, absorbent wiping material. If moss wasn't available, they used twisted clumps of sheep's wool, or quite simply, water. However, archaeology has given us a strange and specific artifact often found in Viking settlements like York and Dublin. It's a small, smooth wooden spatula, sometimes called a toilet spoon. While more common on land, it is highly likely these personal hygiene tools were carried in a warrior's belt pouch. You would use the wood to scrape clean, then rinse the tool in the ocean. It was sustainable, reusable, and by modern standards, absolutely horrific. But the lack of modern sanitation had consequences far worse than just a bad smell. It created a biological time bomb. Archaeological excavations of Viking latrine sites, particularly at the Jorvik Centre in York, have analysed fossilised Viking excrement, known scientifically as coprolites. What they found inside these ancient remains tells a terrifying story of gut health. Almost every Viking was infested with intestinal worms. We are talking about whipworms and Maw-worms, parasites that grow up to a foot long inside the human intestine. On a longship, where hygiene was impossible and hands were rarely washed before eating, the transmission rate would have been 100%. If one man on the ship had dysentery or a parasitic infection, the shared buckets, the close sleeping quarters, and the shared food bowls meant that within a week, the entire crew would be infected. Imagine being a terrifying warrior heading into battle while suffering from severe abdominal cramps, bloating, and malnutrition caused by the worms stealing your food. This biological reality might explain the Viking reputation for berserker rage. They weren't just angry, they were constantly physically uncomfortable, likely in pain, and living in a state of chronic gut inflammation. There is also a social aspect to this that we need to consider. Today, the bathroom is the ultimate private sanctuary. To the Vikings, privacy was a foreign concept. They slept huddled together for warmth, they ate together, and they relieved themselves together. There was no shame in the bodily function. In fact, in Norse culture, waste sometimes took on a ritualistic or insulting significance. There was a practice called the nithing pole, where a horse's head would be placed on a pole to curse an enemy. But in some sagas, acts of defecation were used to insult rivals or mark territory. So, did they ever stop? Did the ship ever pull over? Yes, Vikings were master navigators, but they preferred coastal hopping when possible. If the ship was hugging the coastline, the crew would beach the vessel at night. They would set up onshore camps, creating temporary latrines on the beach, essentially digging pits in the sand or soil away from the camp. This was the preferred method. It allowed them to stretch their legs, cook hot food, and escape the sensory overload of the ship's deck. But during the deep ocean crossings, like the voyages to Iceland, Greenland, or the brave journey to North America, there was no stopping. For weeks, they were trapped in that wooden shell. This endurance is actually a testament to their incredible toughness. We often think of their toughness in terms of how many sword hits they could take or how heavy their axes were. But the real toughness was psychological. To endure the squalor, the smell, the lack of dignity, and the constant physical discomfort of a longship voyage required a mental fortitude that is hard for us to comprehend. They sacrificed every comfort known to man for the chance of wealth and glory. When you look at the sleek lines of a Viking ship in a museum today, it looks beautiful. It looks clean, but you have to mentally populate it. You have to add the smell of tar, sweat, and unwashed men. You have to add the sound of the wind and the groans of the timber. And you have to realize that for the men on board, the battle wasn't just against the Saxons or the Franks. The first battle was against their own environment. It was a battle against disease, against the elements, and against the utter lack of sanitation. So the next time you see a movie where a Viking hero stands tall at the bow of the ship, looking fresh and romantic, remember the bucket, remember the moss, and remember the worms. It changes the way you look at history, doesn't it? It brings up an interesting question about the trade-offs of the past. Considering the utter lack of privacy and the horrific hygiene conditions on these long voyages, it makes you wonder about the motivation. Which aspect of this voyage would have broken you first? Would it be the freezing cold water, the complete lack of privacy while using the bathroom, or the knowledge that you were sharing your sleeping space with thousands of parasites? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.